Okay, this is kind of an odd topic to be talking about at this meeting because obviously you're here sharing ideas and insights related to the research you're doing, which is highly collaborative and actually progresses through that collaborative process of sharing and building on the insights of others and through the open literature contributing those ideas back. And some of you may be aware that over the last couple of years there has been increasing attention focused by certainly Congress and the US government on what's generally called research security as applied to that open fundamental research, which in a way sounds a bit like an oxymoron. We're not talking about security of classified stuff, which obviously we do a lot of at Los Alamos, but more about the concern that the publicly funded research that has been responsible for so much of the innovation, economic prosperity that you heard about in the previous remarks has the potential to be potentially taken advantage of or diverted in some inappropriate way. And some of you at universities have probably had to fill out new disclosure forms that have flowed from this concern. And you may have read in the newspapers about court cases and arrests under this thing called the China Initiative that have caused a lot of concern. And so I thought it would be interesting to try and understand a little bit the historical context of this, because this is not a new thing, understand to what extent is there something we ought to be concerned about, and how ought we as a nation respond to the challenges that are being discussed. But before I launch into the talk, I need to check because in preparing for this, we had a meeting with Poe and some of the staff, and what they told me was that the whole point of this is to have a really interactive discussion, and therefore, we don't want you to talk for 3.5 hours and leave no room for discussion with this group of people. And I was assured that if we shared the view graphs ahead of time, everyone would read them, and therefore I could go really quickly. So I'd like a quick show of hands. Has anyone actually looked at the view graphs? Okay. I'll try and do like the accelerated trip through them, but I feel like in order to have a discussion, I have to stimulate it a little bit. So bear with me. I'm going to go pretty fast, but if I skip over something and you want me to dig deeper, just interrupt me. So don't wait. I'm happy to sort of divert and move in different directions. So I'll press the big green button and see what happens. So first off, the whole idea that the government would invest in R&D is actually a relatively recent invention. Prior to the Second World War, there was very limited government involvement in R&D, certainly in what we would call fundamental research and development. It was kind of more of a hobby for the wealthy or someone who had a patron. If you read Galileo's work, he's always very careful to acknowledge his patrons in the opening pages. There were a small number of universities, places like Cambridge, that had resources. Oxford owns most of, the shopping districts in London and so forth. And so they had the wherewithal to kind of pay for research that didn't necessarily have an obvious connection to anything of economic value, but was more aimed at understanding how the world worked. There were exceptions, of course. The military sometimes funded R&D. An example of that would be the Royal Navy's competition to solve the problem of longitude. A counterexample really is actually the Wright brothers. The Army was an early customer, purchasing a plane in 1909, but did not pay for the development. That was all done kind of through private means, and the Army only bought a plane after it could demonstrate that it could fly a certain distance at a certain speed. So there was no government R&D at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, that would have supported that. The Morrill Act established the land-grant universities, and that provided some federal support through things like agricultural extension programs. But there was a pretty clear tie between fairly applied transfer of knowledge of, biology of plants and animals and public well-being that sort of provided a justification for that investment. And so in these examples, pre-World War II, the focus really was on the application of knowledge where you could have some kind of clear link between the taxpayer investments and well-being of the population. The thing that led to this change really was a consequence of a couple examples of really rapid innovation translating what had only recently been pretty fundamental, disconnected from anything of known value, research in physics primarily, into things that had a significant impact on the Second World War. And this was done under the auspices initially of something called the Office of Scientific Research and Development. It was actually established by executive order in December of 1941. It had been worked on prior to that, so Pearl Harbor was kind of a precipitating event, but the work had already been underway to mobilize and coordinate military R&D. It was led by this fellow, Vannevar Bush, from MIT and the Carnegie Institution. And it was under the auspices of this OSRD that, for example, radar was developed, proximity fuses, both really critical in the ability of Britain to withstand the Battle of Britain and the attack that it was under from Germany, and of course, famously, the initial phases of the atomic bomb. And in fact, I'm just going to see, I think I may have, no, okay. It was under the auspices of OSRD that something called the S1 Executive Committee that was set up to oversee these research efforts. This was the most closely held OSRD activity. It was not widely known amongst the military or even the Congress. The Vice President did not know what was going on. And prior to the establishment of OSRD, there were actually voluntary efforts to hold back on publication in the area of fission because of concerns that it might help a Nazi effort. So fission was discovered in December of 1938 by Hahn and Strassmann working in Germany, and Frisch and Meitner actually were the ones who figured out that it was fission that was going on. And pretty much any competent practicing physicist in December of 1939, when Niels Bohr took a boat to Washington and gave a talk at a physics conference, could pretty quickly calculate that this had the potential for enormous release of energy. So as a result, some of the people in that photograph, actually Fermi being one of them, and Leo Szilard and others, organized a self-organized group of physicists to refrain from publishing in the open literature. And in fact, Fermi and Szilard did key experiments that showed that neutrons were produced. They submitted it to physical review because they wanted to establish priority through the date that they submitted it, but asked physical review not to publish it until they'd consulted with the military to determine whether or not it needed to be protected. And there was pretty good agreement among practicing physicists in the UK and the US that they were not going to publish in this area. There was no classification. This was sort of self-organized. It fell apart largely because the Joliet Curies in France continued to publish, and the physicists were loyal. They did not want to help the Germans, but they really didn't want to be scooped. So as a result, they began publishing again until OSRD was created, started funding the work, and of course with the funding came the requirement that it be treated as secret. So this is probably the first example, this early stage prior to OSRD of what you might call research security. This was very fundamental research, understanding subatomic physics. And probably the only other analogous situation is what happened in the early stages of synthetic biology, where people working in the field got together at Shelter Island and said, okay, we need to be careful how we deal with this, and tried to develop some guidelines for publication and use. Again, completely outside of any formal system of classification. So In August of 1942, the OSRD transitioned the atomic bomb effort to the Army Corps of Engineers under General Leslie Groves. The work continued to be very closely held, very limited access by the military, the administration, and Congress. In fact, there's a book called Restricted Data, which I recommend to you, which is a history of sort of nuclear secrecy around this. There was a lot of debate about the need for classification, but also whether or not the need for classification and compartmentalization would impede the efforts to develop a bomb to end the war. And in fact, that's the reason Los Alamos was selected as a site, because it was felt like with a remote location, we can put everyone together, they'll be able to share freely amongst themselves, but knowledge won't propagate beyond the fence. And following the war, this separate system of classification was codified in something called the Atomic Energy Act. And in fact, the modern system of classification of what's called national security information came later. It was actually in the atomic area that there was the first kind of system of classification called restricted data. So at the end of the war, Vannevar Bush wrote a fairly often cited report called The Endless Frontier that was kind of summarizing a set of recommendations for post-war research and development. And it made the case that science is a proper concern of government, that's in quotations, but also that there was a need to preserve freedom of inquiry. So Bush pointed out that, this Maxwell's equations, late 19th century physics, turned into radar. And Chadwick's discovery of the neutron in 1932 turned into fission. So the US had benefited tremendously from these fundamental science research that through government investment focused on high priority national needs at a time of war had resulted in really transformational breakthroughs, and there was a need to kind of replenish the supply, that's the way he characterized it, of fundamental knowledge. The recommendations in this report included the prompt lifting of security restrictions on wartime research to allow transfer to industry. There was an interest in nuclear energy that was desired to be stimulated. In fact, the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project were permitted to publish some of their work, not all of it. Also recommended a program to educate returning GIs. This kind of gets back to the first recommendation of Marcia McNutt, and in fact had a huge, I would argue, transformational impact on the S&T workforce in the US, the GI Bill, probably something we need to look to overcome some of our challenges today. It also recommended the establishment of robust government funding for basic research. This led to the National Science Foundation and the national labs. So this represents a change from, previously having rather limited investments in what we would call now high technology readiness level research for agriculture and so forth. And I think you can make an argument that this formed the blueprint for actually the US success in the second half of the 20th century and ultimately prevailing in the Cold War due to the economic and technological consequences of the decisions that flowed from this report. So with the Atomic Energy Act, you had this new category of restricted data that was classified. You can't share it. That was a barrier to rapid progress, of course, in some areas. And in 1953, Eisenhower gave a famous speech shown here in the picture at the United Nations called the Atoms for Peace speech, and advocated for allowing for greater cooperation around some things that had previously, or at that time, were still classified as restricted data around nuclear energy and isotopes. Isotopes for medical and industrial uses, and obviously nuclear energy for electric power generation. And in fact, the Atomic Energy Act was amended to allow for the sharing in this area. And this was an instance where basically the desire to protect and classify and not share came into conflict with the desire for rapid progress. And the outcome of that was, okay, we're going to share more because we want to make rapid progress. And, there were regimes that developed over time to manage the fact that some of these technologies were dual use and things like export controls and eventually the Non-Proliferation Treaty and something called ITAR, International Traffic and Arms Regulation legislation were introduced to kind of manage the stuff that wasn't classified, but we still want to be a little bit careful because it can be diverted in nefarious ways. So you had the emergence of this intermediate kind of categories of information. By the 80s, in the US, there were starting to be concerns about competitiveness. At that time, it was principally focused on Japan. The 80s was when the US suddenly discovered that other countries could make cars that were cheaper and more reliable and performed better. And so there was a lot of concern that Japan was going to overtake us economically. And in addition, of course, it was the height of the Cold War, so there were concerns about then Soviet attempts to gain access to the science and technology that was being developed in US labs and universities. And so that led to a kind of situation where different funders of research were trying to make up their own restrictions to apply to the research dollars that came with them, which was sort of frustrating to people in the research community. And it led to a couple of important things. First were two acts of Congress that were both passed in 1980, one called Bayh-Dole and another one called Stevenson-Weidler. These were intended to foster transfer of federally funded R&D to the private sector. So the whole apparatus that exists now for tech transfer, where universities have tech transfer offices and they try and license stuff, and people in universities are encouraged to spin out companies and so forth, had its origin in these acts. This was what I would call a go faster response to international competition. So the US is funding all this research. We're concerned about our competitive situation. We want to encourage the transfer of that knowledge to the private sector so that we can benefit economically. A couple of years later, in the Reagan administration, something called NSDD 189 was issued, and this was the response on the kind of concerns about East Bloc, so Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact countries, trying to surreptitiously gain access to American research and development, technology development at universities and government labs. The interesting thing about this is that the response was actually the opposite of what you might have expected. And it's captured in this statement. It's a very short thing. It's 2 pages long. It's the policy of this administration that to the maximum extent possible, the products of fundamental research remain unrestricted. And the only dividing line was to be, if it's classified, we're not going to share it. If it's unclassified, unrestricted. Asterisk, oh, by the way, there's export controls and proprietary information. So there's a little sort of exception that says, except as provided by statute, that allows for some of this gray space. So basically, and this was quite hotly debated at the time, NSDD 189 said, we understand there are risks from international engagement. Our competitive position is enhanced by going faster, so we don't want to impose restrictions. So that was 1985. So shortly after that, the Cold War ended. And as I said, I think you can make the case that the US, our allies, the West, prevailed because of both the strength and technological sophistication of our defense and also the strength and technological sophistication of our economies. And in a sense, that endless frontier model that was conceived at the end of the Second World War prevailed. And I think the assumption was that, hey, capitalism and democracy, won the day. And now, clearly, everyone else is going to adopt that playbook. And if we're all playing by that set of rules, we should do pretty well because we invented the rule book. And so for the post-Cold War period, you had discussions of things like the flat world, globalization, rapid innovation, and there wasn't a lot of discussion about, the need for protection because the big adversary, Soviet Union, had, basically fallen apart into disarray. So the expectation then was that this economic liberalization, the desire for prosperity, would naturally lead to democratization. That was the hope. So now we're in what I would call the post-Cold War era. And turns out it was not the end of history. Famous book by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History. History did not end. And somewhere around 2010, you can argue about exactly when it was, Putin gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 where he told the world what he was going to do. And we didn't really listen. Xi Jinping came to power in about 2012. Things began to change. Russia began to systematically withdraw from and undermine the kind of rules-based order. And China, in a fairly pronounced way, abandoned what had been their policy of what was called peaceful rise, which basically was predicated on the idea we want to grow the standard of living for our population. We need to modernize our economy, grow our manufacturing in order to create prosperity. And in order for that to be successful, we have to engage globally in trade, and we can't, destabilize that by being threatening in a sort of military kind of a way. That had been the policy, from Deng on, basically, until about 2012, and began to shift to a more aggressive response. There are things like the Made in China 2025 policy that underpinned a lot of desire to acquire foreign technology, to move from manufacturing, you buy your Apple computer, it's made in Shenzhen, but if you look at it, it says designed in California. The economic value is largely accrued in California. And so if you're China, you're saying, okay, we could get to a certain point manufacturing stuff designed in other places. If we really want to capture the value, we've got to have more engagement in the intellectual side of the enterprise where the value is created in the design. This is a totally sensible response. Also, pretty dramatic expansion and enhancement of military capabilities. You have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is trying to build connections around the world, both economic and military, so it has to do with both trade and basing. And things like the 1,000 Talents program, which is a response to the US program that we don't call the Million Talents program, but has been an extraordinarily successful program of recruiting the best and the brightest from around the world, since the end of the Second World War. This leads to the question then, is that endless frontier model really fit for purpose in the 20th century? For the first half of the Cold War, the US economy, Europe was in ruins, Japan was in ruins, China was still basically an impoverished nation. The US economy was not just the largest in the world, it was larger than everyone else put together. And our R&D enterprise was not just the largest in the world, it was largest than everyone else put together. So we never had to have an industrial policy. We would get our, quote, fair share by default. If there was a new discovery that had some economic value, chances are it would be discovered here and it would be commercialized here. So the taxpayers who paid for that R&D would get their return. For the second half of the Cold War, as I said, things began to change a little bit. We became concerned about competition from Europe and Japan. But remember, they were our allies. So in some sense, the fact that they had rebuilt from the Second World War and were now becoming, big economies, although, we worried about jobs and so forth, they were all part of the same system, and there was an element of, rising tide floats all boats. So it didn't have that same sort of level of concern. And of course, immediately following the end of the Cold War, the view was, as I said, everyone's going to adopt our rules and our ways of doing business, so we should do just fine because we wrote the rule book. We now have a different situation. We have an active military conflict in Europe involving Russia. China is engaged in very aggressive technological and economic competition with very tight military integration. And I haven't even discussed, what's going on in the Middle East with Hamas, Iran, and Israel, North Korea, and so forth. So it's reasonable to ask the question is, does that mid-20th century model work, or do we need to adjust in some way? And we're trying to adjust. I would say fits and starts and some pretty bad missteps along the way. So the Department of Justice had this thing called the China Initiative, which many of you have probably heard of. There's a picture of Charles Lieber. Here's a hint. Someone gives you an envelope full of $100 bills. Think carefully. And some successful prosecutions. The Lieber prosecution is an example of one that led to conviction. Some really visible failures and huge missteps by law enforcement where they just did not understand the research environment and launched some really poorly conceived efforts that were very harmful to people who had really done nothing wrong. There's a thing called National Security Presidential Memorandum 33 that was actually interestingly issued under the Trump administration, implemented under Biden. There are not too many areas of policy of continuity between those two administrations. This is actually one of them. This is a telling thing, actually, that particularly the concerns around the competitive and military and economic threat posed by China is one of the few things of agreement in Congress. And you saw this, for example, in the debates around the Chips and Science Act, where research security featured prominently. We did this. The scientific community went to Congress and said, there's all these transformational disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, energy technology, all the stuff you're talking about here. It's a competition with China. We need more money. And Congress said, okay, we're going to authorize more money. They haven't actually appropriated most of it, but we're going to authorize more money. But how can you assure us that the investments the U.S. taxpayers are making are going to accrue to the benefit of the U.S. people and not be commercialized elsewhere? So it's actually not an unreasonable question. This is a quote from Anna Puglisi, who was at the Office of Director of National Intelligence. When she was there, she would give a great talk called Beyond Espionage, principally focused on China, because, let's face it, that is really what's underneath this research security discussion. There are other problematic actors out there, certainly, Russia and so forth, but it's principally focused on China. Extreme propositions such as closing our eyes, laissez-faire, or closing our doors only benefit China. So we have to be thoughtful how we respond. Yes, there are real threats. There are certainly examples of egregious behavior that run counter to our view of research ethics and fair play in an open research environment, and we have to recognize that and respond to it. On the other hand, if our response is to close the doors, we're going to really shoot ourselves in the foot. So we have to be thoughtful about how we respond. And I think in the interest of time, I have some examples that I could go through, and if you want to ask me about why the Mars rover is a good example, or how AI is a great case study for both the risks and benefits of international engagement, I'm happy to go through them. But I think this is the real fundamental question. Does international engagement benefit U.S. economic and national security? And as I said, I think the answer is yes. And much of the debate that's going on right now is about protecting more, and certainly there are things we need to protect. But, to use a sports analogy, you would never say, should we have a strong offense or defense? You actually need both. You need to score goals, and you need to prevent goals from being scored. And a really important point here is, and this is something that I think we miss in the scientific community, we really enjoy international collaboration. We have friends and colleagues from around the world, and that adds richness to our discussion. The question is not, do we enjoy it? That's not what policymakers are asking. Who wouldn't want to go to a summer school in Sardinia? Put up your hand, okay? We all love that. The question is, does it benefit our economic and national security? That's the question we need to focus on. And the answer, I believe, is yes. I'm not going to go through the case studies in the interest of time, but I'll just flip through to if you want to hear more about the case studies, just ask me. Okay, AI. The counterexample is what I call the East German innovation model. So at the end of the Cold War, I was working in Denmark. I was working at a Danish national lab. We had lots of collaborators from West Germany. And when the wall came down, all the West German researchers got sent to East Germany to visit the research institutes because they were going to have to reintegrate. And the interesting thing, when they came back, was they weren't surprised that their East German counterparts were behind scientifically and technologically. That did not come as a surprise. What surprised them is that they did not know how far behind they were. And it was because they'd been isolated. And they really truly believed that they were, at the cutting edge, and they'd been left in the dust years or decades before. So I think that is the most dangerous aspect of isolation, is if we close ourselves off, especially given the fact that we're no longer bigger than everyone else put together. If we close ourselves off, we run the risk of being overtaken, and we run the risk of not realizing that we've been overtaken because we're not at the cutting edge. So I think this is a really important model. And I think at that point, I'm going to stop. I don't know if I have yeah, there's the end. So I think we do need to find a new balance, and this is important too. If you look at all of the examples that are out there now, as I said, there have been some really poorly conceived, damaging actions that have been taken, particularly under the auspices of this China initiative, that were huge setbacks. But at the same time, there have been really egregious abuses. And certainly if you look at, and Anna Puglisi, who I cited before, she has a great paper that was submitted as congressional testimony that walks through some of this. There has been very deliberate action taken by particularly the government of China to take advantage of aspects of our open research ecosystem. In most cases, they're not illegal. That's the whole point, actually. That's why a lot of those prosecutions were poorly conceived. But on the other hand, even though open literature research is going to be available to anyone with a library card in a couple of years, that doesn't mean that it's okay to take those results, start a company in another country without recognizing the intellectual property rights of the researchers involved in the development or the institution in which they work, or the US taxpayer who paid for the research. It doesn't mean that it's okay to take a proposal that you were given to peer review and share that with your colleagues in another country so that they can pursue the same line of research. So there are real issues that we need to deal with, and the great concern that I have is that if we're not careful, our response to those kind of abuses will create harm to our own research ecosystem and actually undermine our competitive situation. So it's really important we get it right. And I think with that, I'm going to stop. It was a little bit more than 15 minutes, but it was the kind of quick version, so there's hopefully some time for questions and discussion.
Well, that certainly was something to think about. The way the microphones will work is there's one microphone moving around that looks like that, and there's another microphone looking around that looks like that. That cube can be passed around, but please don't throw it or else we'll break glass. So, okay, but with that, go for it.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So, my question is, of course, in the United States, a large amount of research is done in universities and government, but also a huge amount is done in private enterprise. How well protected is that research, in your view, from our adversaries?
Yeah, and that's typically not included. The industrial research is typically not included in this discussion of research security, which has principally been focused on government investments in universities and labs. Of course, industry does have mechanisms for protection, things like patents and protection of intellectual property and trade secrets. There's a legal framework around that. The challenge is that it's only enforceable in jurisdictions that play by the rules. And so that's, I think, where the greatest risk has been. And certainly if you look at the kind of multifaceted efforts at science and technology acquisition, a big part of it is targeting industry. Often, using cyber attacks to exfiltrate information, which is, a problem that's plaguing all kinds of institutions. And there are bad actors everywhere, There are bad actors in this country, there are bad actors in other countries, but if you have a robust system of protection of intellectual property, you have recourse, you have a mechanism to enforce your rights. If you have a robust system of research ethics, if someone steals your results, you can, if a researcher at another institution had concerns that someone at Los Alamos National Lab had, stolen their results and published it without acknowledgement, we have a system to kind of take action. So one of the challenges I think in this area is that people tend to conflate trust of individuals with trust of a system. And it's not the same thing. So there may be people who you know well and trust, and they're honorable individuals and they're going to treat me well. But if they're working in a system that doesn't have that kind of protection, you can get yourself in trouble. That's certainly true for the industrial cases where the biggest challenge is just enforcement. The mechanisms exist, but if there's no way to enforce it, then you can't stop other countries from producing counterfeit products or infringement, and it has to do with, as I said, is the system trustworthy? And in some cases the answer is yes, and in some cases the answer is no. I think that's actually part of the solution, in the sense that there ought to be, I think, a mechanism kind of like, pre-check, where you go through a little bit of extra stuff up front, but you don't have to remove your shoes and get rid of your laptop. You go through security faster, and I think we ought to have a system where we can say, look, between Canada and the US, we have pretty common legal framework for protection of intellectual property. We have similar requirements for research ethics. If you're, one case that was cited recently was not that long ago, there was a paper retracted that because it was a collaboration between Danish researchers and researchers in China, where it turned out that the genetic information that had been collected on Uyghurs in China for the purposes of the study had not received their informed consent. That may have been perfectly okay under the rules China operates under, but if you're in Denmark or the United States or Canada, it's a problem. So I think it would be helpful if we had some sort of system to say, the system's there so that when there are bad actors, we can respond, and then encourage collaboration as much as possible within that framework. And if you're not part of that framework, then it doesn't mean don't collaborate, it just means be careful. You may have to do your own human subjects review if the country with which you're partnering doesn't have an appropriate system to do it. Yep.
I think I have the red box, so I can go with this. So Shannon E. in 2008, Hertz Fellow at Georgia Tech. University research enterprises are kind of going through like a major shift right now. They're trying to figure things out, they're experimenting. A lot of this is coming through with volatility in federal funding, right? And recognizing that industry funding and philanthropic funding are starting to eclipse what we're seeing at the federal side. Gates Foundation is expending more money than the National Science Foundation. Right? Given this shift and change, what is that interaction with universities and national labs looking like, given that such a large support from the federal government goes to national labs?
Well, I would say that, in terms of research security and research ethics, I think those are values that should be present independent of the source of funding. Nobody wants their ideas stolen. Where the difference between government funding and non-government funding may come into play is, what rules get imposed through that funding stream. So the federal government now, as a result of this NSPM 33, is imposing requirements on recipients of federal dollars to say you have to have a program in research security, you have to do disclosures so that we can see whether or not there's a conflict of interest and so forth. The government can do that because they're sending the money. So, they can't force a university to set up this system, but they can say, hey, if you want our money, you need the system. And obviously, if you're dealing with a non-governmental entity, they may have a different set of expectations. But I think the general idea that we need to protect the openness of our research ecosystem, and part of protecting it is reducing the chances of abuse, I think that's true no matter who's paying for it. And some of it, I mean, in a way, if you look at where the discussion was in terms of research ethics several years ago, it's evolved a lot since then. And, I think there's even things like the human subjects example that I mentioned. That's a framework that it took time to build up and kind of define what are the guardrails. And of course, in the US, we had terrible abuses, like the Tuskegee Airmen and so forth, where people were subject to, without their consent, sometimes dangerous experimental treatments. And so, we learned from that, and we've set up a framework. And as I said, that framework is actually applied now as a kind of standard of behavior for research, whether the Gates Foundation is funding the vaccine development or NIH. There's certain expectations of how you're going to do the research to determine the safety and efficacy of that vaccine that are, universally accepted within our system and within most of the systems of Europe and Japan and, to lesser extent maybe in other countries.
So as much as it probably wouldn't work with bad actors, I'm curious how much flexibility or innovation you think there could be when it comes to protecting IP or even viewing maybe like papers that are published as something if eventually it becomes prior art for a patent. Like, is there any way that you could imagine like there being some value or IP protection for published papers, or you think that's completely off the question?
Well, I mean, there have been some changes recently in terms of how patent protection is developed. There's now sort of first to apply doctrine, which was not previously the case. But I think in general, the idea that once you put it out there in the open literature, it's out there. So in that sense, what most of the concern is what goes on before you put it out there in the open literature, and whether that's, okay, I'm going to apply for a patent, or I'm still doing the work and it's not fully vetted and I don't want to put it out there because it might be wrong, or it could be, I haven't even really figured out whether or not there's potential commercial application. There is this sort of space pre-publication where I think you do need to be more careful.
Like the timescale of a patent, or there's research that's going to be much more like foundational and like longer term before it's patentable, and it seems weird that like there's no mechanism somewhere between patent and copyright for like the fact that just to recognize that like one day this work might be valuable.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's essentially what trade secrets are in a certain sense, right?
But like a patent is supposed to incentivize companies to put things out there, and academics are already doing it, but they give up value in a way that seems like we're missing something if like the NSF is funding so much research, for example.
Yeah, I mean, speed is a problem. You saw this a bit with COVID, where, and that was one of the examples that I had, where, in COVID, everything in that field very quickly went to preprints. And of course, there were systems set up to disseminate preprints, but, it was an emergency. People couldn't wait for deliberate peer review and, going back and addressing referees C's unreasonable comments and, all that sort of stuff. And so, the response of the system was to very rapidly just go to preprint sharing, which I think was appropriate given the fact that it was an emergency. But at the same time, if you look at the vaccines that were developed, there were huge private investments for years and years before COVID came along that were made by people who had reasonable expectation of return based on protection of the intellectual property around it. So I think even in fast-moving fields, there's merit to trying to figure out some way to do it. I think you just have to recognize that, sometimes any system you set up is going to be overtaken by events. And, and I think in COVID, everyone did the best they could, which is in some sense, that's, the most you can hope for.
So, is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah. So, you just basically recapped about 40 years of my life. You know, in the early 2000s, I was working on a laser program in Albuquerque, and I had the Air Force Office of Special Investigation come and tell me that there was a group of Chinese graduate students at the University of New Mexico that sole purpose was to keep track of what I was doing, and I needed to shut down my outward-looking web page and tell my scientists and engineers they could no longer publish. But by the same token, I also watched the U.S. government almost destroy the space radar business in this country because we put restrictions on what they could develop and sell, and the result was that people around the world, like the Israelis and the Germans, developed their own radar systems and put us behind the track. So I kind of I struggled with this throughout my whole career, and I kind of framed a statement that I used to use a lot, which is technology doesn't know its application until we tell it. And so I wonder if your thoughts are, you know, is there a way that, because innovation comes from trying to solve a problem, and for the most part, right? But it comes from basic science, where people are looking at things and they discover something interesting. And, oh wow, that can lead to the development of a lot of power. And that power can be generating electricity for, you know, the public, or a weapon. So your thoughts, you know, your Los Alamos, which does a lot of technology that can have many different applications. How do we tackle that situation where we're able to exchange ideas where we don't really know what the application might be for a technology? Because I think that's a critical part of this. How do we capture that technology and benefit from a global opportunity to look at the potential of that technology?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great and difficult question. You know, there in the 70s was when this whole idea of technology readiness levels was developed. It was developed by NASA. And, you know, DOD adopted it, and they have 6.1 and 6.2. It's, you know, fundamental research all the way to prototype and so forth. And, you know, there's this view that there's this linear process, and all we need to do is at a certain point in time, when you really start to get close to the point of application where you know what you're using it for, you can make a decision. Am I going to make this classified? Am I going to protect the intellectual property? And that's a nice, simple system that bears no resemblance to reality. Because it's, you know, there isn't this lovely progression of fundamental science to, you know, more use-inspired research. Because if you're trying to solve a problem, you'll get so far and then discover that things aren't working the way you expected, and you have to go back to the basic science, and sometimes you'll make some discovery that almost instantly turns into an end-use application. So as nice it is to sort of lay it out in your budget or your textbook or your plan for protecting your research, it's just more complicated. And so I think that it's certainly true. You know, personally, I think it's a good thing that we don't publish our designs of nuclear weapons. That's probably, you know, not too hard. So there are certainly use cases where you can look at it and say, yeah, that's pretty clear. On the other hand, you know, the LIGO and gravity waves, not so concerned about weapons applications, although there's some pretty cool laser stuff in there, you know, that could potentially be used in some other way. And I think where you find those areas where you're not sure, I think you're better off to do like NSDD 189 and default to innovating rapidly. And I remember a discussion I once had with a guy, there's a guy named Jensen Huang, who you may have heard of. He's the CEO of NVIDIA, and I was talking with him about this topic because NVIDIA has research institutes in China. And I said, what's your approach to that? Are you worried about your intellectual property being compromised and, people making chips that are based on your IP? And he said, first off, anything we do there, we assume it's gone. It's just, and so there's some things we don't do there. But we assume it's gone, and our approach is by the time that someone else has put it to practice, we're going to be another 2 generations ahead. So we're going to be faster. And they want access to smart people all around the world because it allows them to go faster. So they've made a decision that says, okay, we're prepared to tolerate the fact that we're going to lose some stuff, in return for which we get access to more smart people and we can move faster, and that's going to be our competitive advantage. And, that's certainly in a tech company in a very fast-moving field, that can apply. Now, it may not apply in all areas. There may be some areas where you're just not prepared to accept the loss, and you're prepared to accept a little friction in your gears. That's essentially what export controls are. Right? Export controls don't prevent the information from getting out, they just slow it down. And they slow us down too. And we apply them in areas where we're prepared to get slowed down a little bit because, the consequences of others going fast is something we can't tolerate. But I think in general, we're better off defaulting to the go faster approach. But that doesn't mean don't do anything. If your ideas are being stolen, you ought to respond and be thoughtful. And it may mean that we are more comfortable collaborating with countries and institutions and people who agree to the framework of open, transparent sharing of information that we agree to. And if as I said, it doesn't mean we won't collaborate with others, but we're going to have to apply some additional protections to compensate for the fact that maybe the systems are coercing people to do things that are inappropriate.
Hi, super interesting, thought-provoking stuff. I had a very similar question as the previous question, but coming from a completely different context. And it was the LIGO comment that made me shoot my hand in the air. And so maybe I can explain a little context. So I'm a physics professor. I'm a particle physicist. And one of the things, I didn't see it in your slides, but one of the case studies that I immediately thought of was CERN. And the fact that particle physics is such an international endeavor. And I feel like I have kind of 2 questions branching off from that as an example, one of which is, maybe is there something that we can learn from the structure of how the field of particle physics is organized, given that it is, by construction, needs to be so global? And the second thing, which was along the lines of the previous question, is, one of the spin-offs of CERN was the internet. And obviously, that was not foreseen, right?
We thought, technically the World Wide Web, actually. The internet was already
okay,
there.
But, obviously, right, things spiraled from there in ways that couldn't really have been predicted. It started, we're just doing this very fundamental science, but now we have, foreign governments doing election interference using social media or bots or whatever else people can think of. So, okay, so there's the 2 questions. One is, can we learn something from other fields that are more international than some of the other examples that you've listed? And second, can we even reasonably predict, or impose things a priori, kind of along the lines of the previous question?
Yeah, I think the way that I tend to think about this is that, which is embedded actually or drawn from the way the Department of Energy has started to try and approach this, is to think of it in terms of a matrix. So one axis is basically the sensitivity of the scientific or technical area, and the other axis is who are you dealing with. Okay, so there are some areas of research where I would just say we ought to collaborate as much as we can, and high energy physics would be an example. There are other examples as well, astronomy, cosmology, and so forth. And I think that's why high energy physics has this great tradition of international collaboration, because it was in an area where you were somewhat more removed from military application. In fact, I'm pretty sure CERN in its founding statutes is not allowed to do anything remotely military related. And so that's, in a certain sense, a ripe area where it ought to be really easy to collaborate, because the consequences of loss of information are not great. It doesn't mean it's not relevant, because as you point out, World Wide Web, there are other technologies that have come out of those big collaborations in terms of superconducting magnets that are valuable for MRI machines, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not without value, but there's so many steps along the way before you hit that value that, I don't think we need to be too concerned about overly regulating where those interactions are. And those facilities are big and expensive. We ought to share the load, across more of the world's population. On the other hand, there are research activities that are, a little bit closer to the pointy end of the spear. And whether that pointy end of the spear is, actual military application or just high value intellectual property that have impacts for national competitiveness. And I think those are areas where you need to be thoughtful, even if it's maybe open literature research. You need to be thoughtful about, do I know who I'm working with? Do I know why they're working on this particular topic and what they're going to be doing with the information? You have to apply a little bit more scrutiny. And there, I think who you're dealing with part becomes more important. Do they come from a system that's going to provide recourse in the event of theft of intellectual property and that sort of thing? So I think you can certainly identify large areas of research. In fact, probably the majority of university research falls into areas where you don't have to have too much concern. But there certainly are topics where it's probably a good idea to understand, why people are interested and who's really paying them and who are they working for, because they do start to impinge on things where you might have concerns.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So we've talked a lot about sort of export control and how much IP we can share with other countries. Now, I'm wondering about like a very closely related subject is like once we implement export controls, then it's natural that other countries like will do the same to us, right? And so like, especially for some like important areas, like for example, in like photovoltaics and batteries, right? Like a lot of the rare earth elements that are necessary for that are like found in China. And so we can consider that if we are implementing a lot of export controls, then like what if like these other countries limit the like, materials that we need, limit us from getting those. And similarly, like the cost of production of things can be like much cheaper in like other countries. We know that labor costs are much higher in the US, and like manufacturing everything here will drive up prices, take longer, and like potentially drive up inflation. And so like I wonder if you have thoughts on like balancing export control and sharing of IP versus like the limitations that we would experience from other countries controlling what's given to us.
Yeah, I mean, export controls are kind of a blunt instrument, and anything that you have to codify in a list that's printed on paper is, probably not super responsive to the real world environment. And the other thing that you have to recognize, and certainly we're going to see this in the AI example where we're now applying export controls on NVIDIA chips to China. Again, going back to Jensen Huang, his comment on this was, Huawei's lame, but they're not 6 times lame. And, China is going to develop the technology anyway. So all you're doing with export controls is you're buying some time. So my question is, what are you doing with the time that you're buying? If all you're trying to do is stop the promulgation of technology that you are not trying to take advantage of, I would say it's pointless. There may be reasons to buy yourself time in a competitive environment, but you better have a strategy for how you're going to take advantage of that. And that, I think, is one of the challenges we have right now, and you're seeing this in the debate about AI. Everyone's saying, oh, God, we got to control the sale of these chips and big private sector investments. Where's the public investment in artificial intelligence to serve public needs? So far, it's really not there. So we're not doing anything with whatever limited amount of time we may be securing. And this was in one of my case studies. You can see it in the slides. Right now, actually, the U.S. leads the world in AI R&D. And as measured, so there's a study by the Paulson Institute, did it in 2020 and 2023, where they looked at invited talks at peer-reviewed conferences, which for most computer science and AI, that's actually the measure of quality. It's not peer-reviewed publications in the literature because the field moves too quickly. So the way you know who's really good is who's giving the marquee talks at the big conferences. So they looked at this database in 2020 and 2023 and found out that the U.S. is leading in terms of AI R&D. The gap is narrowing from 2020 to 2023. And the principal reason the U.S. is leading is because of a massive influx of talent from other countries. Okay. So, in fact, this is an example where I would say controls will hurt us if we slow that down. So, you may get some momentary advantage in terms of how much energy you expend training, because that's the real difference between the high-end chips and the slightly less high-end chips. You just need more electricity, that's all. It doesn't change what you can do. And if we try and control too much, and one of the things with export controls is you actually limit access of foreign nationals within the US. It's called a deemed export, right? So if we close that down, we just killed our big competitive advantage, which is the only thing that's keeping us ahead in this field, highly competitive field.
Okay, so we do have time for a couple more if we need. Put up your hands. New mic runner over here, keeping it interesting. Ruby, I see you.
Thank you. I feel like we've spoken a lot about the defensive techniques, and I was wondering, beyond running faster than anyone else, what are the sort of scope of offensive techniques that you feel the U.S. government or would be willing to consider in the competition with China and other countries?
Well, I referenced in the Vannevar Bush paper the GI Bill, right? That had a huge effect on U.S. science and technology in the post-war period. And if you're concerned about the fact that we are, we are reliant, over 50% of our graduate students in physical sciences and engineering are from other countries. And that's a good thing in the sense that people are coming and often they stay. And if you look at the number of startups that have, foreign nationals who are part of the original conceivers of the company and so forth, you can demonstrate there's value in that. But it is absolutely true that the West of the world is becoming more attractive for people to go back to. And so part of a, response to that ought to be the investments we make in our own population to get educated in these fields, which of course is exactly what the Hertz Foundation is doing. The only problem is there's 180 people here, right? And there's 300 million people in the US. And so if you want the scale, that would have to be something that the government does. So that would be one example, I think. And given the cost of higher education, I mean, it used to be not that long ago, some people in this room went to school at a time where you could earn enough money in the summer to pay for your education the rest of the year. That's not true anymore, not even close. And so I think, looking at ways to encourage and support a larger fraction of our population to get educated in these fields is one thing. I think another element of what attracts people to this country actually is the amazing capabilities that we have in science and technology. Things like our National High Magnetic Field Lab, where the former Hertz fellow was the director until recently, and at Livermore with NIF and so forth. And we are in a very fortunate position that we still have, these amazing capabilities that are world leading. No one else has yet achieved ignition. It's probably going to take a little while for them to get there because it's pretty hard to do. But that we are coasting on investments that were made 20, 30 years ago. And, to look at where we are now and say, oh, it's great, we've got, highest magnetic fields, we achieved ignition, we got the highest intensity pulse neutron source in the world, it's all great, is sort of neglecting the fact that those investments were made, as I said, 20 or 30 years ago, and the rest of the world is catching up and poised to overtake. And so I do think we need to look at the state of our scientific infrastructure, because that's what attracts people to this country. It's also the sort of excitement that keeps people in their fields. And, if the roofs are leaking figuratively, or maybe even literally, it's hard to argue that it's a state-of-the-art research infrastructure. And I think one of the other big challenges that we have in communicating this is, and I certainly see this in talking to lawmakers, the premise on defense is that we have the best stuff and we need to protect it. There are significant areas of research where, yeah, we're relevant, but we are not necessarily the sole world leader. We may not be the world leader at all. We're active and we're relevant, and those are fields where actually I think the way to sort of stay ahead is by being smart in how we collaborate and reach out to others. So I think another part of offense, if you will, is kind of informed and smart international collaboration, risk-aware international collaboration. If you read things like the National Defense Strategy, what it will say is part of the U.S. advantage in national defense is our network of partners and allies, which is something that means we don't have to do everything. And I think that same thing is true in research. So if I had to pick 3 things that we ought to do to make sure that we have the best, most competitive research infrastructure, it would be kind of, 21st century GI Bill, recapitalization of our core infrastructure, and a smart strategy for international engagement where we double down on partnership with institutions and countries that share our values and objectives to solve big problems like climate change.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I had a question about trying to protect the technical expertise within this country. You mentioned the FBI is going after all these very senior, very established faculty, but let's be real. We all know none of these faculty actually know what's going on. It's the graduate students that we actually want to know how to do everything in the lab, all right? So then at one point, this country recognizes, after the Tiananmen Square, this country announced that all graduate students from mainland China or Taiwan studying in this country can have green card the moment they walk into the U.S. embassy then. Yeah. So because of that, you saw the massive wave of technical expertise enter this country. Today, at Carnegie Mellon in the machine learning department, about 2/3 of PhD students are international students, most of which are from the mainland China. If you talk to these people in private, most of them actually want to stay in this country. Opportunity here is much better. However, they are unable to stay in this country because it's almost impossible to get a green card nowadays unless your parents are very rich. Is there any discussion within federal government about whether or not this policy actually aligns with our national interest?
Yeah, this is a tough one because the whole topic of immigration reform gets tangled up in the issue of the southern border, which is actually, in some sense, not relevant to this discussion. But politically, it's highly relevant. and has prevented any kind of progress on this front for quite some time. The Tiananmen Square example is a great one, and it sort of gets back to this thing I mentioned. China instituted this 1,000 Talents program. It was a response to our Million Talents program, which has been hugely successful. But I don't know how to have that discussion at a political level, which is where it needs to happen. I mean, it does require legislative action. There has been talk about shifting to I don't want to be careful about the loaded language here or whatever, but many other countries have immigration systems where they actively encourage people who have expertise in areas that are relevant to that country's objectives. So countries like Australia and Canada and so forth have these so-called merit-based immigration systems. That, as I said, they're designed to actively encourage people who have skills that are desired by those economies. Our system doesn't really function that way, and it would require legislative action to actually change it, which is really, really hard to do. To be honest, I think and I've sort of said this, some of you may be, if you really follow this closely, which I admit you have to be kind of nerdily focused on it. To do that, there's been legislation that's been introduced to actually have the opposite effect. So we've had legislation introduced that would prohibit nationals of 5 countries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Cuba, from setting foot in U.S. national labs. And we have nationals of many of those countries, not so many Iranians and North Koreans, to be honest, who work in our lab. They're in this country legally. In some cases, they're green card holders. I think the dumbest thing we could do is force them to leave. They don't want to go back. They're here for a reason. They've made a decision to raise their families here. It would be ludicrous for us to say, okay, your only choice is to go back to, Russia or China. If a pink slip is pretty persuasive because you lose your visa in many cases if it's an employment visa. So they will have no choice. That is absurd. I would say so far we've been successful at making the case, but it's not going away, and we're going to have to continue to tell the story. And to be honest, some of you are probably going to be the best case studies for why we need to do this, because a lot of you did come to this country from elsewhere, even though you're maybe now U.S. citizens and green card holders in order to be eligible for a Hertz Fellowship. And so your success actually becomes part of our argument for why the U.S. benefits from that. So go out and do great things, and it will help us make the case.
Thank you for answering my question. I see the applause.
Yeah. Any other questions?
We have one more. I've been told this is the last question. All right. I wondered, building on Ruby's question about offense, one of the things that we saw during COVID was that coordination leads to speed. And if our goal is to win because we're super fast, having coordination across a lot of people focusing on one thing versus being split across a bajillion things that we're trying to do could be a way of coordinating offense. And this is also a principle that applies in startups. You could look at like the JFK moonshot sort of thing as another example of this. On the other hand, we don't want to restrict freedom. On the other hand, maybe political will to do this is pretty tough to get. I'm curious if you see any opportunity for the US rallying behind winning at a few key things versus trying to compete at everything.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that even though we're big and rich, relatively speaking, it's no longer reasonable for us to say we are going to have absolute world leadership in every area of science and technology. There's just, there's the rest of the world has actually looked at our playbook, they've emulated it. If you look, US used to lead in the percentage of the population with undergraduate degrees. It's no longer true. Other countries overtook us 30 years ago. The rest of the world has been catching up, and that's a good thing because, that creates more prosperity and raises standards of living. But it also means that, at some point in time, we only have 5% of the world's population. We're still about 20% of the world's economy and probably 20% of the research and innovation. So we're punching above our weight, but that means there's 80%, that's not us. So I do think that some of what that implies is making choices and saying what areas are really important to us, and therefore we need to make sure we prioritize. There's finite resources. But I also think that then that sort of suggests that in other areas, we better have collaboration with others as part of our playbook. Because if we're saying, okay, we can't lead in every area, we certainly want to be part of it in pretty much every area. And that's a hard thing to do because basically you're going to have to decide, am I going to be a leader or am I going to be a fast follower? And for our own individual research areas, of course, we'll all advocate for leadership, but not if you can't do everything, you're going to have to opt for fast followership and partnership model, and I think that's actually okay. And there's some areas like high energy physics, for example, where I would say partnership is the way to go. CERN is not in the US. We gave that up when the SSC was canceled. And that was a terrible blow to the high energy physics community, but actually we're still doing great high energy physics, and it happens that we're doing a lot of it at CERN, and maybe that's okay, because it's not as existentially tied to a really strong security or economic interest, and it's something done on behalf of the global population.
All right. Well, let's give Tom a hand. It's very interesting.
Thank you very much.
And we have a gift for you as well.